A thin German shepherd walked alone through fresh Montana snow, stopping at places no one seemed to use anymore. Former Navy SEAL Merritt followed from a distance and realized the dog was not lost. He was moving with purpose. The shepherd was Aurel, once a celebrated rescue canine, but the road he remembered held no famous rescues and no hidden glory. It led instead to old meeting points, forgotten cabins, and people who had slowly stopped checking on one another. As Aurel's aging body began to fail, Merritt faced a harder question. Should he stop the dog, or finally understand what the dog was trying to continue? Sometimes the most important mission is not saving a life in danger, but making sure a life has not been forgotten. Tell us where you're watching from, and if Aurel's story speaks to you, please like and subscribe to help Valor Dog Stories reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. By the last week of February, Bitterroot Valley had taken on the hard brightness that came only after fresh snow. The fields along Highway 38 were buried beneath a clean white layer, and the morning sun struck the Sapphire Mountains so sharply that the ridgelines seemed cut from metal. Snowbanks threw back enough light to make Merritt narrow his eyes behind the windshield of the county pickup. He had been on the road since 7. 3 avalanche warning stations needed inspection before the afternoon temperature shift, and Merritt preferred working early, before traffic began moving between Hamilton and the smaller communities farther south. At 51, he had become a man who trusted schedules, because schedules rarely asked questions. The military had taught him to move toward uncertainty. Civilian life had taught him to reduce it. His inspection sheet rested on the passenger seat beside a thermos and a canvas tool bag. A scratched silver carabiner hung from the right side of his belt, clicking softly against the seat buckle whenever the truck hit uneven pavement. Merritt had carried that carabiner for years, not from the teams, from afterward. That distinction mattered to him. The road curved around a frozen drainage ditch, and that was when he saw the dog. At first, Merritt barely registered it. A German shepherd moving along a winter highway was unusual, but not impossible. Ranch dogs wandered, hunters lost dogs, people left gates unsecured. Then Merritt passed it. 30 yards later, his foot came off the accelerator. He checked the mirror. The dog was still walking south along the shoulder. Thin. That was the first thing Merritt noticed clearly. The German shepherd's coat was golden through the chest and flanks, darker across the back, but the winter fur could not hide the slight hollow behind the ribs. The dog's gait was controlled, not weak, yet there was something economical about every step, as if unnecessary movement had been discarded. Merritt slowed to 20 miles an hour. The dog did not look at the truck. That interested him more than the ribs. Most loose dogs responded to vehicles somehow. They watched, they chased, they moved away. They showed fear or curiosity. This one ignored him. Merritt rolled another 100 yards. The dog climbed a slight rise along the roadside, stopped where the ground gave a clear view in both directions, and turned its head. Not toward Merritt, behind itself. The dog held there for 3 seconds, perhaps 4, then continued. Merritt drove on. He should have kept driving. Station 9 had been giving intermittent signal faults since Tuesday, and there was snow in the forecast before dark. The county did not pay him to investigate stray animals, but after another quarter mile, Merritt saw the dog stop again. Higher ground. Clear sight line. Pause. Check behind. Continue. His hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel. "No," he said quietly. The word had nothing to do with the dog. It was his reaction to recognition. Merritt pulled onto the shoulder. He waited until the shepherd had gained another 40 yards before stepping out. Cold air entered beneath the collar of his slate-shell jacket immediately. Under it, he wore the olive-drab combat shirt he still preferred for field work. Its camouflage sleeves faded from years of washing and weather. The dog heard the door. One ear turned. The body did not. Merritt stayed beside the pickup. "Hey!" No response. He opened the rear compartment and found half a packet of dried beef from the previous day.
The shepherd finally stopped when Merritt approached to within 20 feet. Merritt crouched rather than advancing farther. Up close, the dog's age became easier to see. There was silver beginning around the black muzzle.
The right ear carried an old, narrow tear near the tip. A pale patch of fur ran down the chest in a long, triangular shape. The eyes were dark amber, alert but not anxious. Merritt placed 2 strips of beef on the snow, then he backed away. The shepherd watched him. There was none of the desperate fixation Merritt expected from a hungry animal. After perhaps half a minute, the dog approached, smelled the meat, ate 1 strip, then half of the second. It left the rest. Merritt looked at the visible ribs again. "You're hungry enough to show it," he murmured, "just not hungry enough to stop." The shepherd met his eyes. For a few seconds, Merritt experienced the strange impression that he was being evaluated. Then the dog turned away and continued south. Merritt stood in the road shoulder holding the empty food packet. He had known trained dogs overseas, on bases, around joint teams, and later during occasional work with mountain rescue units. What bothered him was not that the shepherd seemed trained, it was the type of training. The dog was not wandering, it was working a route. Merritt returned to his truck. He looked at the inspection sheet, then at the road ahead. Station 9 could wait 20 minutes. That was what he told himself. 20 minutes became 43. The shepherd left Highway 38 near an old service road almost hidden beneath fresh snow. Merritt followed in 4-wheel drive, keeping enough distance that the truck would not push the dog forward. The service road opened into a broad white meadow. Sunlight covered everything, the kind of day tourists described as peaceful. Merritt had spent too many years outdoors to mistake beauty for safety. Snow could hide ditches, weak ice, broken fencing, abandoned wire. The dog crossed the meadow without hesitation. Near the base of a low slope stood an old roadside rest area that Merritt vaguely remembered from years earlier. The county had closed it when the newer pullout was built farther west. 1 picnic table remained. Its wooden top was buried beneath 6 inches of snow. The shepherd walked directly to it, then sat. Merritt stopped the truck 50 yards away. He waited. The dog did nothing. 5 minutes passed, then 7. Merritt stepped out and scanned the area. No footprints except the dog's, no vehicle tracks, no blood, no disturbed snow, no collapsed structure. Nothing that suggested a person had recently been there. The shepherd simply sat beside the abandoned picnic table, looking toward the empty road. Merritt felt something shift inside his understanding of the morning. He had expected purpose. Now he was looking at ritual. The distinction made him uneasy. At 10 minutes, almost exactly, the shepherd rose. It shook snow from 1 forepaw, then walked away. Merritt glanced at his watch. 10 minutes, not 9, not 15, 10. He followed again. By noon, his inspection schedule had become fiction. The dog crossed an old wooden bridge where a shallow creek moved dark beneath crusted ice. It stopped at the far end, waited, looked back, moved on. At a ridge turnout overlooking Bitterroot Valley, it stopped again. Below them, ranch roofs broke through the snow, thin smoke lifting almost straight into the blue sky. The shepherd sat facing the valley. Merritt remained in the truck this time. He had learned enough not to interrupt. The dog stayed there for several minutes, then left. Merritt rubbed a thumb over the scratched carabiner at his belt. There had been a time when he would have called the pattern coincidence. He had also once believed that leaving military service meant he would stop noticing patterns everywhere. Neither had turned out to be true. By mid-afternoon, the shepherd had reached an abandoned gravel lot bordered by chain-link fencing. A weathered sign remained attached to one section. Bitterroot Regional Rescue Annex. Closed. Merritt knew the building, or what had been there.
Years earlier, county rescue crews had stored snowmobiles, climbing gear, and emergency generators at the annex before operations were consolidated closer to Hamilton. The main building had been demolished, leaving only the lot, a storage shed, and concrete slabs under the snow. The dog walked to the center of the empty property. It stopped. Merritt watched from behind the windshield. For the first time all day, the shepherd seemed uncertain, not lost, something quieter than that. It turned toward where the main building had once stood, waited. Nothing came. The shepherd's ears remained raised for almost a minute, then slowly lowered. Merritt felt an unexpected pressure in his chest. He knew that posture, not from dogs, from people. The body, still waiting for something the mind had not accepted, was gone. He opened his door but did not call out. Away. The shepherd eventually moved on. By 4:30, the sunlight had begun to flatten behind the mountains. The hard blue of the morning softened toward gray, and wind started lifting loose snow from the shoulders of the road. Merritt had completed only one inspection. His supervisor would have questions. For once, Merritt found that prospect less important than it normally would have been. The shepherd's pace had changed. Subtly at first, a fraction less extension in the rear legs, a pause after climbing a drift. Then Merritt saw the right hind leg tremble. The dog stopped beside a fence post, tried to continue. The leg trembled again. "That's enough." Merritt parked abruptly and got out. The shepherd looked at him. Merritt approached slowly. This time, the dog did not walk away. "You've made your point." The words sounded ridiculous in the open winter air. Merritt moved closer. The shepherd's body remained tense, but not defensive. When Merritt reached for the collar, he discovered there wasn't one. No tag, no identification. Just thick fur and a body too lean for the cold. Merritt opened the rear door of the pickup. The shepherd stared at the seat. "No," Merritt pointed. "Whatever you're doing, you're done for today." The dog did not move. Merritt waited, so did the dog. Eventually Merritt exhaled, bent down, slid one arm beneath the chest and the other behind the hindquarters, and lifted. The shepherd was lighter than it should have been. That disturbed him more than he expected. For one brief instant the dog resisted, then the tension left its body. Merritt placed it carefully on the rear bench. The shepherd immediately turned to face the rear window, still watching the route, even while being taken away from it. Merritt shut the door. Hamilton was nearly dark when he pulled into Bitterroot Valley Veterinary Clinic. Dr. Elise Wardell was preparing to close. She was 47, compact and straight-backed, with reddish-brown hair twisted into a low knot and thin-framed glasses she wore only when looking at charts. Her dusty blue scrubs were partly covered by a charcoal fleece jacket. She looked from Merritt to the dog and then back again. "Your dog?" "No." "Hit by a vehicle?" "No." That answer sounded less useful the second time. Merritt almost smiled. "Found him walking Highway 38. Elise crouched beside the shepherd. The dog allowed her to examine the gums, eyes, paws, joints, and abdomen without protest. "He's underweight," she said. "Not dangerously, but enough that I don't like it in this weather." "Disease?" "Nothing obvious." She listened to the chest. "Heart sounds steady. Breathing is good. Old dog, though." "Not that old." Elise looked at the silvering muzzle. "Older than he thinks." The shepherd lay down on the examination room floor. For the first time all day, he closed his eyes. Elise passed a scanner between the dog's shoulders. It beeped. "There we go." Merritt looked over. "Chip?" "Yes." She moved to the computer. Merritt stood near the examination table while snow tapped softly against the clinic windows. The room smelled of disinfectant, dog hair, and stale coffee. Elise entered the identification number. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that Merritt noticed. "What?" Elise leaned toward the screen. Then she took off her glasses and cleaned them, although Merritt suspected there was nothing wrong with the lenses. "Merritt." He stepped closer. The file displayed a photograph of a younger German shepherd with the same golden coat, The same dark saddle, the same damaged right ear. Below the picture, Aurel, Federal Wilderness Search and Rescue Canine, 7 to 14. Status, retired. Further down came certifications, deployment records, federal search evaluations, wilderness tracking qualifications. More than Merritt could read at a glance. Elise let out a slow breath. I've heard that name. Merritt looked at the dog. Aurel was asleep beside the wall, no vest, no handler, no medals. Just a tired old shepherd with snow melting into a small dark patch beneath his paws. Merritt felt none of the excitement that should have accompanied finding an animal with a record like that. Instead, he thought of the abandoned picnic table, the bridge, the overlook, the empty rescue lot, the 10-minute waits. He looked back at Elise. If he has a file like this, Merritt said, then he has an owner, or someone responsible for him. He should. Merritt watched Aurel's ribs rise and fall. Then that's the part I don't understand. Elise waited. Merritt lowered his voice. If he has somewhere to go home to, why does he keep walking away from it?
Claudia Wren arrived at the clinic before the last of the daylight had disappeared from Hamilton. Merritt noticed her truck first through the front window. A dark green Subaru dusted white along the wheel wells, moving too quickly into the small parking lot before braking hard beside the snowbank. The woman who stepped out moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent most of her life arriving where something had already gone wrong. She was 58, lean without seeming fragile, with ash blonde hair tied low beneath a charcoal knit cap. A burgundy parka hung open over an oatmeal sweater, and a narrow aluminum clipboard was tucked under one arm even though there was no obvious reason to bring paperwork into a veterinary clinic. Dr. Elise Wardle glanced at Merritt. That'll be her. Claudia came through the door carrying cold air with her. Aurel? She did not ask where he was. She saw him almost immediately. Aurel had been asleep against the examination room wall, but at the sound of Claudia's voice his head lifted. The change in him was small and immediate. His ears rose, his body loosened, then he stood. Claudia stopped in the doorway. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Merritt had seen reunions before. Some were loud, some involved people dropping whatever they were carrying, dogs whining, hands shaking, voices breaking. This one was almost painfully quiet. Aurel crossed the room and pressed the side of his head against Claudia's knee. She rested one hand between his ears. That's enough of this, she whispered. Aurel leaned harder against her. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, no animal recoiling from the person it had escaped. Merritt understood at once that one possibility had disappeared. Whatever Aurel was doing, he was not running from Claudia. Elise gave her a moment before speaking. He's underweight, but there's nothing here suggesting neglect or acute illness. Claudia closed her eyes briefly. I know. Merritt looked at her. She heard the judgment in the silence and turned toward him. I know how that sounds. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. There was no defensiveness in her tone, just fatigue. Claudia crouched and ran both hands along Aurel's sides, feeling his ribs as though confirming what she already knew. He eats at home, not always enough lately, but he eats. He has supplements, heated floor in the kennel. He doesn't sleep outside unless he decides he wants 20 minutes of snow under him. Elise nodded toward the computer. His medical history checks out. Claudia gave a tired laugh. I should hope so. I'm the one who keeps half of it. She tapped the clipboard under her arm. Merritt glanced down at Aurel. The shepherd stood beside Claudia with his shoulder touching her leg. Safe. Comfortable. At home, at least with her. It made the day harder to understand, not easier. How long has he been leaving? Merritt asked. Claudia looked at him more carefully now. You're the one who found him? On Highway 38. How far south? Past the old rest area, then the bridge, then the ridge turnout, then the old rescue annex. Claudia's expression changed at the last location, not shock,
Recognition. You followed him that long? He wasn't wandering. That isn't an answer. It's the reason. For the first time, the edge in her face softened slightly. She looked back at Aurel. No, she said. He doesn't wander. Claudia sat in the clinic chair while Elise brought water for Aurel. The story came out without drama, which made it heavier. 6 weeks, 4 departures. The first time Claudia had found Aurel 9 miles from home near an old forestry access road. The second time, 14 miles away. The third, almost 20.
On the fourth, a rancher had called after seeing him cross a service lane near Connor. Claudia had replaced 2 sections of fencing, added a second latch to the yard gate, then a third. She had put a GPS tracker on his collar. After he learned to scrape the collar against the corner of the porch until the tracker came loose, she changed the attachment. She began checking the doors every night before bed and again when she woke. None of it had mattered. He doesn't dig, Claudia said. He doesn't chew through anything. He waits. For what? For me to make a mistake. That answer almost sounded like affection. Almost. Merritt folded his arms. And when you don't? He sleeps. Aurel drank, then lay down beneath Claudia's chair. Claudia continued. He'll go 3 days without trying anything. 4 sometimes. Then there'll be fresh snow overnight. She paused. And before sunrise, he's awake. Merritt looked up. Only after new snow? Every time. That was the first detail that made the room feel smaller. Elise leaned against the counter. You're sure? I started writing it down after the second time. Claudia opened the clipboard. Inside were veterinary records, feeding notes, medication schedules, and several pages covered in dates and times. Merritt took the sheet she offered him. January 11, snow overnight. January 23, 4 inches. February 4, new snow after 2 a.m. February 18, light accumulation. Every date had a departure time beside it, between 5:12 and 6:03 in the morning. You keep records like this for everything? Merritt asked. I spent 27 years making sure rescue teams had the right people, the right fuel, the right equipment, and the right weather information before they disappeared into mountains. Claudia took the paper back. Writing things down is cheaper than guessing. Merritt respected that answer. He also understood now what her former role had been. Not the person rappelling from helicopters, the person who knew which helicopter was fueled, which rope bag had been inspected, and which road would be impassable by noon. The sort of work people rarely called heroic because heroism was usually photographed at the other end. Aurel shifted in his sleep. Claudia looked down at him. He was never like this with Jonas. The name came without explanation at first. Merritt waited. Claudia seemed to realize it. Jonas Vale, his handler. Her voice lost some of its hardness. Primary handler, technically, but those two didn't care much for technical distinctions. Merritt pulled the other chair closer, but did not sit immediately. What happened to him? Heart. Claudia looked toward the darkening window. 11 months ago. There was no accident to dramatize, no failed mission, no line of duty tragedy. Jonas had been at home. He had complained about pressure in his chest after breakfast, called a neighbor, and was gone before the ambulance reached Missoula. He was 61, Claudia said, healthy enough that everyone believed there would be another year to say everything that hadn't been said. Merritt sat down. Aurel opened one eye when the chair moved, then closed it again. What happened to Aurel after that? For a while, not much. Claudia rubbed her thumb along the edge of the clipboard. He searched the house, slept by Jonas's bedroom door, waited at the mudroom around the time they used to leave in the morning. That's expected. I know. Her answer was sharper than necessary, then immediately softened. I know. Grief behavior, routine disruption, we worked through it. She had not treated Aurel like a relic. That became clear as she spoke. Walks,
scent games, short field exercises appropriate for his age, regular veterinary checks, time with former team members.
Eventually, Aurel settled, but he never became quite the same. Not distressed, not destructive. Quieter.
He stopped bringing things, Claudia said.
Merritt looked at her. What things?
Anything. That was when her voice finally cracked, though only slightly. Jonas could leave a glove in the barn, and Aurel would bring it inside. A wrench by the gate, a dropped hat. He always had to return things to somebody. She smiled faintly. Made him unbearable around picnics. Merritt looked at the sleeping dog. Claudia continued more softly. After Jonas died, he stopped carrying things back. Something about that detail reached Merritt more effectively than a larger grief might have. Not because it was tragic, because it was ordinary. A dog had stopped doing one small thing. A habit no newspaper would have mentioned. A piece of personality erased so quietly that only someone who loved him would notice. Merritt reached down and turned the silver carabiner at his belt.
He did it without thinking. Claudia noticed.
What is that?
Nothing. People don't carry nothing for years.
He looked at the scratched aluminum. First piece of gear I bought when I started civilian inspection work. After the Navy? Merritt nodded. Claudia did not ask about the Navy. He appreciated her immediately for that. Instead, she said, "Then it isn't nothing." Merritt let go of the carabiner. Aurel lifted his head. For a moment, his amber eyes moved from Claudia to Merritt and back again. Then he settled between them. The gesture was so simple that neither person commented on it. Elise broke the silence. How famous was he? Claudia sighed. That depends how much nonsense you consider fame. She nodded toward the computer. 8 active years, avalanche work, wildfire searches, missing hikers, structural collapses after storms. He had good instincts and better stamina than most dogs I've worked around. There are articles, Elise said.
There are always articles. The Golden Sentinel of the Rockies? Claudia's mouth tightened.
I hated that name. Elise smiled slightly. I suspected you might. Jonas hated it more. Why? Claudia looked down at Aurel. Because Aurel didn't save people for a headline. He didn't even know what a headline was. She scratched the fur behind his damaged ear. He knew a harness meant work. He knew Jonas's hand signals. He knew when somebody was missing. That was enough. Merritt studied her. You don't sound proud. I am proud, she met his eyes. I just don't confuse pride with turning him into a story people can use to feel something for 5 minutes. That sentence stayed with Merritt. He had spent enough time being introduced by former occupation to understand the difference between being known and being simplified. Elise finished the discharge instructions. More calories, controlled exercise, watch the hind legs, no long-distance wandering.
That last instruction drew a humorless look from Claudia. If only I'd thought of that.
By the time Merritt left the clinic, Claudia had already loaded Aurel into the back of her Subaru. Before closing the hatch, she clipped a dark leather collar around his neck. The GPS unit attached to it was small and black. Aurel stood facing Merritt, not eager, not reluctant, just watching. Merritt stepped closer. You planning to make trouble again? Claudia closed the hatch. He'll wait until I'm sufficiently confident. That sounds deliberate. It is. The Subaru pulled away. Merritt remained in the parking lot after the taillights disappeared. He should have gone home. Instead, he drove back to the county office. The building was almost empty. By 8:30, the cleaning crew had gone and only the vending machines hummed near the stairwell. Merritt sat alone at his desk with the day's inspection report untouched.
He had told himself he wanted to verify something practical, where Aurel had been. That was all.
Claudia had emailed him the GPS tracks from the previous 4 departures because, in her words,
You've already wasted an entire workday on this dog, so you might as well waste it accurately. Merritt opened the first file. A thin blue line appeared across the satellite map, then the second, third, fourth. At first they seemed unrelated. One went southeast, another cut west before turning south. The third ended near an old forestry road. Merritt enlarged the map. He added the route from that morning manually. Something began to bother him. He shifted one trace, zoomed out, then farther out. The separate journeys did not overlap completely. They connected. Not like random excursions from a common home, like pieces. Merritt pulled an older county infrastructure map from the digital archive and layered it over the image. A faded route appeared beneath the GPS tracks. A retired rescue corridor, old staging areas, service access roads, former equipment points. A network that had largely disappeared after regional operations were consolidated years earlier. Merritt leaned back. 4 departures, 4 different segments, 1 line. He searched public reports from Aurel's active years, avalanche sites, wildfire deployments, search grids, high-profile rescues. None matched the route on the screen. That mattered. If Aurel were revisiting places connected to major searches, grief might explain it. Memory attached to intense events. But the route before Merritt was mundane. Old roads, former logistics stops, places that barely existed in current records. He stared at the screen until the office windows reflected his own face back at him. A dog could memorize terrain. A trained dog could retain routines for years. Merritt knew that much. But Aurel had not simply returned to one familiar place. He had broken a long, obsolete route into sections and traveled different pieces of it on different mornings. Fresh snow mornings. He looked again at Claudia's dates, then at the map. For the first time since finding Aurel, Merritt felt less curiosity than discomfort, because the pattern was no longer accidental, and patterns implied reasons. He closed the untouched inspection report, then reopened the map. Aurel could not read it, could not know county boundaries, could not know that the rescue corridor had officially been retired, yet somehow the old dog was following it anyway. Merritt rested his hands on the desk. "What are you remembering?" The empty office gave him nothing back. But Merritt already knew he was not going to leave the question alone. 2 days later, snow returned before dawn. It came quietly, laying a new white skin over the fences, the roofs, the old service roads, and the empty fields outside Darby. Merritt arrived at Claudia's house while the eastern sky was still dark blue. Her cabin sat back from the road among lodgepole pines, warm light glowing through 2 front windows. The yard was wide, enclosed by fencing newer than the house itself. Beyond it stood a small heated kennel with a sloped metal roof. Aurel was not in the kennel. He was standing inside the house beside the front door. Merritt saw him through the glass before Claudia opened it. The shepherd stood perfectly still, facing outward. His leather collar was already on. The small GPS unit sat beneath his throat. Claudia stepped onto the porch, wearing her burgundy parka and carrying a travel mug. "He's been there since 5:20. Merritt looked at his watch. "Has he eaten?" "Half breakfast." "More than last time." "Less than I'd like." Inside, Aurel turned his head once toward them, then back toward the snow. Merritt had spent most of the previous day going through old county maps and records. He had found enough to confirm that the route Aurel was following had once belonged to the Rocky Mountain Search Cooperative, but not enough to explain why. The obvious solution was still to keep the dog inside, lock the doors, wait out the weather, let his body recover. Merritt knew that. Claudia knew it too. Neither of them moved to stop him when Claudia opened the door. Aurel stepped onto the porch. He paused at the top stair, lifted his nose into the cold air, and looked across the yard. Merritt expected urgency. Instead, Aurel seemed almost calm. That made the decision feel heavier. "We stay well back," Merritt said. Claudia nodded. If he starts to fade, we end it. Agreed. Aurel crossed the yard. Claudia opened the gate. He walked through without looking back. They waited a full minute before following. The first part of the route ran along a plowed county lane, then cut east onto an older forestry access road where fresh snow had erased most tire tracks. Merritt drove. Claudia sat beside him with an old folded map across her knees. Aurel stayed several hundred yards ahead, visible against the white whenever the road opened. Neither of them spoke much. It was different from Merritt's first pursuit. Then he had been trying to understand whether the dog was trained. Now, the training was the least interesting question. The route itself had become the problem. At the abandoned rest area, Aurel did exactly what Merritt remembered. He walked to the picnic table, sat, waited. Claudia leaned forward. "What? You see something?" "No." She kept watching. Aurel did not face the road this time. He faced north. After several minutes, he turned his head over his left shoulder, then stood. Claudia's hand stopped on the edge of the map. "Do that again," she whispered. Merritt glanced at her. "He can't hear you." "I know." Aurel moved away from the table. Claudia was already unfolding the map. "What was that?" "The head turn. You recognize it?" "Maybe." She sounded annoyed at herself for saying the word. They waited until Aurel disappeared around the next bend before driving forward. At the old wooden bridge, he stopped again. But he did not sit. He stood at the entrance, lowered his head briefly, then crossed halfway. There, he stopped and looked back. Claudia inhaled sharply. "That's not random," Merritt parked. "You said maybe before. Now I'm saying it isn't." They remained inside the truck. Aurel waited on the bridge. Claudia stared through the windshield. "Jonas used to run a terrain memory drill." Merritt looked at her. "For Aurel?" "For all the advanced dogs, but Aurel was unusually good at it." "What kind of drill?" Claudia traced a finger across the old map. "They called it long return." The name brought no recognition. She continued. "A handler would take a dog through a long route with multiple checkpoints, different surfaces, elevation changes, road crossings, structures. At each point, the dog got a distinct cue." "Verbal?" "Sometimes, mostly body position, direction, waiting behavior." Merritt looked toward the bridge. Aurel had turned again. "He was taught to remember the sequence?" "Yes." "And return through it?" "In reverse." That caught Merritt. "Reverse?" Claudia nodded. "That was the entire point. The dog would travel outward through the route with the handler, then work back through the checkpoints in reverse order." Merritt looked at Aurel. The shepherd left the bridge, continued south. "But that's not what he's doing." "No." Claudia's voice had changed. Less certain now, more unsettled. "He's going forward!" The old road climbed gradually. At one point, they lost Aurel behind a bank of snow and had to rely on the GPS signal. He appeared again near the ridge turnout. There, instead of sitting immediately, Aurel circled once. He faced west, waited, then stepped to the edge of the overlook and sat. Claudia pressed her lips together. "That was a release position." "You're sure?" "Yes." "From long return?" "Part of it." Merritt watched the dog. "So he remembers the exercise." Claudia shook her head. "Not exactly." "What does that mean?" "It means he remembers pieces of it." She opened the glove compartment without asking, found a pencil, and began marking symbols on the old map. Picnic table, bridge, overlook, the abandoned annex. Different notation at each. Merritt let her work. For almost 20 minutes, the only sounds inside the truck were pencil against paper and the low idle of the engine. Aurel rose again. They followed. The old annex looked even emptier under fresh snow. Only the storage shed remained above the white ground. Aurel entered through the broken section of chain-link fence and walked toward the center. This time he did not simply wait. He turned in a slow semicircle, stopped facing the old concrete pad, then stepped backward 2 paces. Claudia went pale. Merritt noticed. "What?" She did not answer. "Claudia!" "That was Jonas." "What was?" "The 2 steps back." She looked at him. "He used to train that himself." Merritt frowned. "A command?" "No, a habit." She pushed open the passenger door. Merritt caught her sleeve before she stepped out. "We said distance." "I know." Her eyes remained on Aurel, but that wasn't part of any standard sequence. She sat back down. For the first time since they had started that morning, Merritt understood that Claudia was no longer simply helping him observe. She was remembering, and memory was changing the meaning of what they saw. Aurel turned from the old annex and continued toward the southern tree line. Merritt restarted the truck. What did Jonas do after the 2 steps? Claudia thought. Usually checked behind him. For the dog? For people? Merritt glanced at her. She seemed almost irritated by the answer. Jonas hated leaving a site without counting everyone twice. That detail stayed between them. Not dramatic, not coded, just personal. A habit one man had repeated often enough for a dog to absorb. The route carried them farther than Merritt expected. Some stretches were no longer maintained at all. At one point he left the pickup at a locked forestry gate and they continued on foot. Aurel moved steadily through knee-deep snow. Merritt kept watching the hindquarters for tremor. None yet. Claudia walked beside him. "This is stupid," she said. "Following him? Letting him make sense?" Merritt looked over. She kept her eyes forward. Dogs remember patterns, everyone knows that, but people love turning memory into intention. "You think that's what we're doing?" "I don't know." She adjusted the clipboard strap beneath her arm. "That's what bothers me." Merritt understood. They were trying to avoid telling themselves a prettier story than the evidence deserved. He respected her for that. Ahead, Aurel stopped. The terrain opened into a broad, snow-covered meadow. At the far side stood an old lodge, 2 stories, dark timber walls, a deep porch beneath a roof heavily loaded with snow. Smoke rose from a metal chimney. The building was not abandoned. That alone surprised Merritt. Aurel crossed the meadow. His pace quickened for the first time all day. Not much, but enough. Merritt and Claudia stopped near the tree line. A man stood on the lodge porch pushing snow from the edge of the roof with a long-handled rake. He was broad through the chest and neck despite his age, dressed in a rust-red insulated work jacket over a forest green flannel. Thick white eyebrows stood out beneath a faded cap. His hair was short and white, curling slightly around the ears. He lowered the roof rake. Aurel stopped 20 yards away. The man stared. The tool slid from his hand and struck the porch boards. "Jesus!" Claudia whispered the name before Merritt could ask. "Dean." The man stepped off the porch. Dean Harcourt, 63, had once led mountain rescue teams across this part of Montana. Merritt knew the name from old incident reports, but the man in front of him looked less like a former commander than someone interrupted halfway through an ordinary winter chore. Dean came down the steps slowly. Aurel remained where he was. For one strange moment, Merritt expected the dog to rush toward him. He did not. Aurel sat. Dean stopped. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then Aurel tilted his head slightly to the left. Dean covered his face with one hand. Claudia looked away. Merritt stayed still. This reunion was nothing like Aurel's greeting with Claudia. There was no immediate contact, no pressure of head against knee, just recognition traveling across 20 yards of snow. Dean finally walked forward. When he reached Aurel, he lowered himself carefully onto one knee. "You old bastard." Aurel stood. Dean put both hands around the dog's neck. For several seconds, the only movement came from snow sliding off the lodge roof behind them. When Dean stood again, His face had changed. Not broken, opened. He looked past Aurel toward Claudia. "You let him come out here?" "We followed him." Dean blinked. "What do you mean followed?" Merritt stepped forward. "He brought us." Dean looked at him then, properly, for the first time. Claudia introduced them. Merritt Cole. He found Aurel on Highway 38 2 days ago. Dean studied Merritt briefly, then returned his attention to the dog. "He hasn't been here since Jonas died." That sentence drew Merritt closer. "You recognize the route he took?" "Some of it." "Long return?" Dean's brow tightened. "Who told you that?" "I did," Claudia said. Dean gave a slow nod. "Jonas ran it all over this valley." Merritt glanced back across the meadow. "We thought Aurel might be repeating the drill." Dean looked at Aurel, then at Claudia. "No." The certainty was immediate. Claudia folded her arms. "Why not?" "Because this place was never on long return." Silence. Merritt felt the structure of the day shift again. Dean pointed toward the lodge. This wasn't a training site. "What was it?" Merritt asked. Dean picked up the snow rake and leaned it against the porch. "Where we came after." "After what?" "Everything." His answer was simple. Missions, searches, training days, recoveries. Bad weather, good outcomes, bad ones. The lodge had once served as an informal gathering point for members of the cooperative. Coffee, gear repairs, paperwork nobody wanted to finish, meals after long nights. Jonas brought Aurel there constantly. "Sometimes after a deployment," Dean said. "Sometimes when nothing was happening at all." Merritt looked toward Aurel. The dog had walked to the porch and was sniffing near one of the steps. "Why?" Dean shrugged. "Because people were here?" That answer mattered more than Merritt expected. Claudia looked at her map again. "The picnic table, the bridge, the annex." Dean nodded slowly as she named them. "Those all had teen uses." "Training?" "Some." "Not all?" Dean looked toward the meadow. "No." He stepped closer to the map. "Some were meeting points, places where Jonas picked people up, dropped gear, checked vehicles." Merritt watched Claudia's pencil stop moving. The route was changing shape again. Not geographically, in meaning. He looked at Aurel. The shepherd had lain down beneath the porch, close enough to Dean's boots that the older man could touch him without bending far. Merritt thought about the 4 previous GPS traces. Different sections, different stops. Aurel waiting at each. Not searching the ground, not searching buildings, waiting. For the first time, Merritt considered a possibility that had nothing to do with terrain memory. "What if the checkpoints aren't the point?" he said. Claudia looked up. Dean did too. Merritt nodded toward Aurel. "What if the people are?" Nobody answered immediately. Snow began falling from the roof edge in slow clumps. Dean looked down at the dog. "Jonas used to make rounds." Claudia's eyes narrowed. "What rounds?" Dean did not answer that question yet. Instead, he looked across the meadow toward the old road Aurel had taken. And Merritt understood that whatever the route had once been called, Aurel might not be retracing an exercise at all. He might be following a list. A list made not of places, but of people. Dean Harcourt kept the old records in a storage room behind the lodge kitchen. The room smelled of cedar, dust, machine oil, and paper that had survived too many winters. Merritt followed Dean inside while Claudia remained near the porch with Aurel. Through the narrow window in the door, Merritt could see the shepherd stretched beneath the eave, his gold and black coat bright against the snow. Dean switched on a bare ceiling light. Metal shelving lined 3 walls. Most of what remained from the old rescue days was unremarkable. Dented equipment cases, retired radio chargers, rope bags with faded inspection tags, boxes of maps, old coffee tins filled with bolts and carabiners nobody trusted anymore.
Merritt found that reassuring. Real work usually left behind more clutter than legend. Dean crouched beside the bottom shelf. If Jonas had anything on those routes, it'll be in here. He pulled out a gray archive box. Merritt took the other side. The cardboard was soft at the corners. On the lid, written in black marker, were 3 words: Winter, Logistics, Retired. Nothing about rescues. Nothing about Aurel. Nothing that sounded important. Dean carried it to an old dining table near the kitchen. Claudia came inside after making sure Aurel was settled with water. "He's staying put?" Dean asked. "For the moment." That dog never respected a schedule unless it was his. Claudia gave him a look. "He respected mine." Dean smiled. "For approximately 11 minutes at a time." It was the first moment since Merritt met them that the old team felt visible as something other than loss. Not through a photograph, through the ease of an argument they had clearly repeated years ago. Dean opened the box. Inside were binders, folded route sheets, fuel logs, handwritten checklists, equipment transfer forms, and several plastic sleeves containing maps. Merritt began sorting. His instincts went toward incident numbers, deployment dates, search zones. Anything that might connect Aurel's route with the dramatic parts of his career: a wildfire search outside Salmon, an avalanche deployment near Lost Trail Pass, 2 multi-day missing person operations, a structural collapse after heavy snow. He found Aurel's call sign in several margins. Nothing matched. Claudia watched him for a while. "You're still looking for a big mission." Merritt did not look up. "I'm looking for an event strong enough to build that kind of memory." "Same thing." "No." "Close enough." Dean leaned back against the counter. "She's right." Merritt looked at both of them. "I'm being outnumbered." "Used to happen to Jonas constantly," Dean said. Merritt returned to the papers. His assumptions still felt reasonable. Dogs remembered repetition, yes, but powerful events could carve patterns too. Somewhere in the old records he expected to find the reason. A major search, a failure, a recovery. Something that explained why Aurel had crossed miles of winter country for places no longer used. Instead, Claudia pulled out a thin binder with a cracked blue cover. She frowned at the faded label. "What?" Dean came closer. Claudia turned the binder around. "Winter Welfare, South Route, North Route." Merritt waited. "That official?" Dean laughed. "Barely." "What was it?" Dean pulled out a chair. "That depended on the winter." Claudia was already flipping through pages. Merritt saw names, addresses, telephone numbers, fuel quantities, boxes checked beside things like propane battery medical refill, wood radio check, road access. The handwriting changed from page to page, but one name appeared repeatedly in the driver column: Jonas Vale. Merritt sat down. This was rescue work? Not really. Dean seemed almost embarrassed by the question. That's why nobody talked about it. He took the binder from Claudia and turned several pages. "Back when the cooperative was larger, we had a lot of retired members scattered through the valley. Some stayed connected, some didn't. A few lived alone pretty far out." "Welfare checks?" "More informal than that." Dean tapped one line with a thick finger. "Jonas started it after that brutal winter in 2016. Roads closed for days. Couple of former teen guys had generators fail. One woman ran low on heating oil." Claudia nodded. "It wasn't only retirees." "No, widows, former volunteers, people recovering from surgery, whoever ended up on the list." Merritt looked again at the binder. "And Aurel?" "Usually in the passenger seat." Dean smiled faintly. "Jonas took him everywhere." The answer was so ordinary that Merritt almost dismissed it. Then Claudia began reading addresses. The old picnic rest area appeared as a rendezvous point. The wooden bridge was listed beside a handwritten note. "Meet R. Kavanaugh here if East Road iced." The rescue annex appeared repeatedly as a supply transfer point.
The ridge turnout had once served as a place where Jonas met another former rescuer who lived beyond a road unsuitable for the team vehicle. Merritt felt the map from the previous night rearranging itself in his mind. Not roads, relationships, not checkpoints, people. He reached for the binder. "Give me that." Claudia did. Merritt laid one of the old maps beside it and traced the entries with his finger. The route did not exactly match every road Aurel had taken, but the sequence did. One place connected to another because a person had once been waiting there. Dean watched him work. "We stopped doing those regularly years ago." "Why?" "People moved, funding got tighter, cooperative changed." "And Jonas?" Dean became quieter. "He kept doing them." "Officially?" "No." Claudia looked up. "I didn't know that." Dean shrugged. "You were gone by then." Claudia had left the cooperative several years before Jonas died. Merritt had known that generally, but he understood now what that meant. Her memory of the organization had an ending. Jonas's routine had continued past it. "How often?" Merritt asked. "Whenever weather got ugly enough." Dean pointed through the lodge window at the new snow. "Especially after a fresh fall." Merritt stopped moving. There it was. The detail Claudia had written down 4 times. New snow. Not because Aurel wanted to play in it, not because snow itself triggered some mysterious grief. Fresh snow had once meant Jonas checked the route. Aurel had learned the weather before he understood the purpose. Claudia sat very still. "He wakes before sunrise." Dean looked at her. "What?" "Every time he leaves, before sunrise." Dean's expression changed. "Jonas liked to get ahead of the plows." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside, Aurel lifted his head from the porch floor. He looked through the glass toward them. Merritt felt something inside him settle into place with uncomfortable precision. The behavior was no longer inexplicable. It was worse than that. It made sense. Aurel had spent years associating fresh snow, early morning, a vehicle, and a chain of familiar stops with one repeated responsibility. Then Jonas died. The vehicle stopped leaving. The route disappeared. But nobody had told the dog that the work was over. Perhaps there had been no way to tell him. Merritt looked through the binder again. The entries were almost offensively mundane. Dropped 2 bags pellets. Checked furnace intake. Coffee, 20 min. Changed smoke detector battery. Rode okay to culvert. Walked last 300 yards. No needs. Stayed to talk. That last line caught him. Merritt read it twice. No needs. Stayed to talk. He had expected a hero's archive. Instead, the legendary dog's unexplained winter journey had led him to a record of coffee, batteries, firewood, and people who might otherwise go several days without seeing anyone. Dean came around the table. "Funny thing is, nobody counted any of this as real work." Merritt kept his eyes on the page. "What counted?" "Calls, searches, rescues." Dean nodded. "The things with clocks running." Claudia closed another folder. "Jonas counted it. Eventually." "What do you mean?" Dean looked toward Aurel. "When we were younger, Jonas was as bad as the rest of us. If nobody was bleeding or missing, he figured the problem could wait." He smiled without humor. "Then people started retiring." Merritt understood that sentence too quickly. The silver carabiner at his belt pressed against the edge of the chair. There had been a period after he left the Navy when his phone rang often. Then less. Men moved, jobs changed, marriages ended. People found routines. Merritt had told himself that this was what healthy transition looked like, everyone getting on with it. He had never asked how much of that belief came from convenience. There were names in his own phone he had not called in years. Not because anything had happened between them, because nothing had happened. That was somehow harder to defend. Claudia was looking at him. Merritt knew she had noticed the change in his face. He disliked being readable. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." That sounded like something.
You're doing the thing you do with that carabiner. Merritt looked down. His thumb was rubbing the scratched metal. He released it. Dean seemed interested. Claudia spared Merritt the explanation. Instead, she turned another page. Some of these people are gone. Dean nodded. Most, probably. He pointed to several names. Moved to Idaho, Arizona. One passed 3 winters ago. Claudia continued down the list. Ruth Kavanaugh? Bozeman. Cal Mercer? Dead. Tom Wickett? Moved in with his sister in Spokane. Every answer removed another imagined destination from Aurel's journey. Merritt looked outside again. The shepherd was not searching for one lost handler. That explanation had been emotionally satisfying because it was simple. A dog missed his person. A dog tried to find him. But Aurel's route was larger than Jonas. He had been visiting the pattern Jonas left behind, the people attached to it. Some gone, some moved, some perhaps still waiting without knowing they were waiting. Claudia turned toward Dean. When Jonas died, who took this over? Dean did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. No one? She asked. Dean looked at the floor. The cooperative doesn't work that way anymore. That wasn't the question. No. The word sounded heavier than Merritt expected. No one took it over. Outside, Aurel rose. He walked to the door and stood facing them through the glass. Dean crossed the room and opened it. The shepherd came inside without invitation, bringing cold air and flecks of snow across the floor. He did not approach Dean. He walked past him, past Claudia, then stopped beside the table. Aurel lowered his nose toward the open binder. Merritt almost laughed at the absurdity of what his mind wanted to make of that. He stopped himself. The dog was smelling old paper. Jonas's scent would be long gone. Anything else would be invention. Aurel turned away from the binder and lay beneath the table. Dean watched him settle. You know what bothers me? Merritt said. Claudia waited. We keep talking about what he remembers. Dean nodded. But memory doesn't explain why he keeps finishing the route. Claudia folded her arms. What does? Merritt looked down at Aurel. Routine? Reinforcement? Training? He paused. Maybe loyalty. The word felt imprecise, but he allowed it. Whatever you call it, he learned that when the snow came, you checked the people. Dean looked away. Merritt continued. And after Jonas died, apparently the dog was the only one who didn't decide that job had ended. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Dean did not defend himself, neither did Claudia. That made Merritt regret the accusation almost immediately. He had no right to enter a history 3 days ago and tell the people inside it how they had failed. But Dean only pulled out another sheet. There's more. It was a winter calendar. Dates ran down the left. Names and stops were arranged across the right. Some were crossed out in red. Some had handwritten notes beside them. Merritt followed the route northward. Most of the entries had explanations: moved, inactive, deceased, no longer occupied. Then he reached the final line, a name. Gareth Boone. Beside it, North Cabin, Cedar Spur. No red line, no update. The last handwritten notation was almost a year old. Checked. Furnace temperamental, brought filters, coffee. Merritt looked at Dean. You know him? Dean's jaw tightened. Yeah. Still there? As far as I know. Claudia turned the calendar toward herself. When was the last time anyone saw him? Dean did not answer. Dean. Jonas. Merritt felt the room become very quiet. Claudia looked up. That was 11 months ago. I know. You haven't been there since? No. Called? Dean hesitated. Couple times early on. And? He answered. That wasn't what I asked. Dean rubbed one hand across his face. No, not lately. There was no emergency in the room, no siren, no proof Gareth was in trouble, only a name on an old sheet of paper. That was precisely why Merritt could not dismiss it. Aurel shifted under the table, resting his muzzle across his front paws. Merritt looked from the dog to the final line. The route they had followed was not finished, not according to the calendar. One checkpoint remained, a cabin north of the valley, and according to the only record in front of them, nobody had gone back in nearly a year. Cedar Spur was farther north than Merritt expected. The road narrowed after the last cluster of mailboxes and disappeared beneath a fresh layer of wind-blown snow. Ponderosa pine and lodgepole crowded both sides, their lower branches heavy enough to bow toward the ditch. Dean drove the first vehicle. Merritt followed in the county pickup with Claudia beside him and Aurel lying across the rear bench. For most of the trip, the dog remained still. That alone made Merritt uneasy. On the earlier route, Aurel had watched everything: roads, turns, tree lines, open ground. Now his muzzle rested on his paws. Every few miles, Merritt checked the rearview mirror. Aurel's eyes were open, just tired. "Still think we should have left him?" Claudia asked. Merritt kept his eyes on the road. "Yes." "You didn't?" "No." "Why?" Merritt did not answer immediately, because the answer sounded worse when spoken aloud. Because Gareth Boone was not simply a location on a map. The route belonged to Aurel as much as it belonged to the people who had once traveled it. And because Merritt had seen what happened at Dean's Lodge. He had watched an old man drop a roof rake because a dog from his former life walked out of the snow. There were some reunions that could not be delegated. "He came this far," Merritt said finally. Claudia looked through the windshield. "That isn't the same as saying it was good for him." "No." Neither of them argued after that. Dean turned onto a narrower lane marked by a cedar post half buried in snow. The cabin appeared a few minutes later. Small, one story, dark timber siding under a steep metal roof. A woodshed leaned against the north side, and a faded red pickup sat beneath a shelter of corrugated steel. Smoke rose from the chimney, but only a thin thread of it. Merritt noticed that before anything else. Not enough smoke for the temperature. Dean parked. Nobody came outside. They waited. Then a curtain shifted. The front door opened. Gareth Boone stood in the doorway wearing a cream thermal shirt beneath an unbuttoned dark blue flannel. At 69, he was lean in a way that suggested age had taken weight, but not structure. His shoulders remained wider than his narrow waist, and his hands looked large even from across the yard. White hair swept back from his forehead, longer than Dean's, almost touching the collar. A week of pale beard followed the line of a long face. He looked at Dean first, then Claudia. His expression hardened slightly. Not anger, preparation. People who lived alone often became good at deciding quickly whether unexpected company was welcome. Dean got out. "Morning, Boone." Gareth leaned against the doorframe. "If this is an intervention, I'm armed with terrible coffee." Dean laughed once. "Still making it too strong? You still complaining before drinking it?" That was enough to reduce the distance between them by several years. Merritt stepped out. Claudia followed. Gareth noticed him. "Who's the big one?" "Merritt Cole," Dean said. "County Avalanche Systems." "That why you brought 3 people to inspect one furnace?" Merritt glanced at the chimney. "So there is something wrong with the furnace." Gareth's eyes narrowed. "Don't encourage him." Then Aurel stood in the back seat. Everything stopped. The dog's head appeared above the window line. Gareth stared. His body changed before his face did. The shoulders dropped. His hands loosened at his sides. "No." Claudia opened the rear door. Aurel stepped carefully into the snow. For 1 second, Gareth looked as though he might retreat into the cabin. Instead, he came down the 2 porch steps. "Aurel?" The shepherd lifted his head. He walked forward, not fast. Not with the deliberate route work gait Merritt had seen on Highway 38. This was slower, almost ordinary. Gareth made it halfway across the yard before his knees bent.
He sat directly in the snow. Dean started forward instinctively. Claudia touched his sleeve. "Leave him." Aurel reached Gareth. The old man put both hands on either side of the dog's neck. He laughed, a sharp, unbelieving sound. "Well, look at you." Aurel leaned in, then lowered his head onto Gareth's thigh. That was all. Gareth's laugh broke apart. He covered his eyes with one hand. Merritt looked away, not because the moment was embarrassing, but because some forms of grief deserved less observation, not more. When he looked back, Gareth was rubbing the fur along Aurel's shoulders. "You got old." Aurel's tail moved once against the snow. "So did I." That got another laugh out of Gareth. This one survived. Inside, the cabin was colder than it should have been. Not dangerous, but wrong. Merritt removed his gloves and held one hand near the register. Weak airflow. Dean went directly to the thermostat. 58? It's comfortable. It's February. I own sweaters. Claudia was already walking toward the utility closet. You always were cheap. Frugal. You once reused a coffee filter 3 times. That was one weekend. That was a moral failure. Gareth pointed toward her. I invited none of you. You opened the door. Moment of weakness. The exchange had the rhythm of people who knew exactly where each other's irritation ended. Merritt listened while examining the furnace. The blower motor was working, but poorly. The filter was dirty enough to reduce airflow, and a vibration from the housing suggested a worn bearing. How long has this sounded like that? Gareth stayed near the table where Aurel now lay beside his chair. Couple weeks? Dean gave him a look. Couple? Maybe 3. Why didn't you call? Gareth shrugged. It still runs. That isn't the point. It is if you're cold. The answer was practical enough to be irritating. Merritt removed the filter. You have replacements? Utility shelf. Claudia found them. There were 2, still wrapped. She held one up. You had filters? Yes. And didn't change it. I was getting to it. When? Spring? Dean muttered something Merritt did not catch. For the next half hour the cabin became busy in an almost absurdly normal way. Merritt serviced what he could without replacing the blower assembly. Dean checked the wood stove flue. Claudia inventoried furnace filters and batteries despite Gareth repeatedly telling her to stop inventorying his life. Aurel remained beside the chair. No mystery, no alerting, no searching. He slept. That was what made Merritt notice the real change. Aurel had spent days insisting on movement. Now, after reaching Gareth, he seemed to have nothing else to do. The job, whatever it meant to him, had arrived somewhere. Gareth put coffee on. It was indeed terrible. Merritt drank it anyway. By late morning, the cabin temperature had risen 4 degrees. Gareth sat at the kitchen table with both hands around his mug. Dean stood by the window. Claudia had finally stopped checking drawers. The silence that came afterward was different from the comfortable quiet of old friends. This one carried a question nobody wanted to phrase badly. Gareth phrased it himself. So, which one of you decided I needed checking on? Dean looked toward Aurel. He did. Gareth smiled, then realized Dean was serious. You're telling me the dog found me? More or less. From where? Claudia explained, not all at once, the 4 departures, the GPS tracks, the old welfare routes, the binder at the lodge. Gareth listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked down at Aurel. The shepherd was asleep against his boot. You're saying Jonas's route? Yes, Claudia said. Gareth rubbed his mouth. Well, that was all for a while. Merritt expected a story about Jonas. Instead, Gareth asked, who else did he go to? Dean named the checkpoints, some of the old names, people who had moved, people who were gone. Gareth nodded at each one. His face did not become visibly sad. It became more distant. Then Dean said, you were the last current address.
Gareth stopped moving. The last? On that schedule. Gareth looked toward the window. Outside, sunlight had begun breaking through the clouds, turning the snow between the trees almost blue-white. So everybody else is gone? Not everybody. But from the old route? Dean hesitated. Mostly. Gareth stared at his coffee. I suppose that makes sense. Nobody answered. He gave a short, dry laugh. Funny phrase, makes sense. Then his thumb moved along a groove in the wooden tabletop.
Nothing about it feels like it does. The change in his voice was subtle enough that Merritt almost missed it. Gareth looked at Aurel. After Jonas died, I figured that was it. Dean leaned against the counter. What was it? Gareth shrugged. That part. He gestured vaguely. The team. The work? No. His answer came faster. The people. The room grew still. Gareth continued. You spend 20 years getting called at 2 in the morning because somebody's car is upside down in a ravine, or some hiker's overdue, or a radio tower's gone down in weather nobody should be driving through. He gave a small smile. You start thinking those are the reasons you know each other. Dean lowered his eyes. And then the calls stop, Gareth said. People retire, somebody moves, somebody dies. Nobody has a reason to call at 2 anymore. He looked at Dean. So they don't call at 10 in the morning either. Dean accepted the statement without defending himself. That made it sharper. Gareth lifted his mug. I stopped coming to the lodge because every time I did, there were fewer chairs occupied. Claudia sat across from him. You could have called. I know. So could we. I know that too. There was no accusation in either voice. That made Merritt think of his own contact list again, how easy it was to interpret mutual silence as agreement. Nobody calls because nobody needs anything. Nobody needs anything because nobody calls. A perfect loop. Aurel shifted and placed his muzzle more firmly across Gareth's boot. Gareth looked down. His expression changed. He came back. Dean nodded. Yeah. The rest of you didn't. Dean took the hit. So far. Gareth looked at him, then laughed under his breath. That your apology? Best one you're getting before lunch. Still terrible at those. Still here. That mattered. Merritt saw it in Gareth's face. Not forgiveness exactly, permission. A door no one had realized was closed, opened an inch. Gareth reached down and ran a hand along Aurel's back. Jonas used to show up whether I asked or not. He did that to everybody, Claudia said. Annoying man. The worst, Gareth smiled. He'd bring furnace filters I already had. Claudia looked toward the unopened box she had found. That part tracks. For several minutes they talked about nothing consequential. A cracked thermos Jonas refused to throw away, Dean backing a trailer into a snowbank, Claudia once labeling the wrong rope bag and denying it for 6 years, Aurel stealing half a roast beef sandwich from a staging table and then returning the napkin. Merritt mostly listened. The stories were not impressive. That was exactly why they worked. The people in them were not heroes. They were co-workers, friends, annoyances, witnesses to one another's ordinary years. And Merritt finally understood what Aurel had preserved. Not Gareth, not Dean, not Jonas, the space between them. The invisible habit of noticing whether another person was still there. By early afternoon they prepared to leave. Merritt told Gareth the furnace blower would need a proper replacement soon. Gareth objected. Merritt ignored him. Dean wrote down the model number. Claudia took Gareth's phone and updated 3 contacts before he could stop her. You always were invasive. You always were bad at paperwork. Aurel stood reluctantly. That concerned Merritt. The dog's first few steps were stiff, Gareth noticed. He all right? Tired, Merritt said. Too tired? Merritt did not answer quickly enough. Claudia did. Probably. Aurel reached the door. Gareth knelt beside him. You don't have to keep checking on me. The shepherd looked at him. Gareth scratched beneath the torn right ear. I mean it. Aurel leaned into the touch.
Merritt watched from behind them. The words were meant for a dog. They were not really about a dog. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, but wind moved through the trees. They had parked the vehicles farther down the lane where the snow was packed. Aurel walked between Merritt and Claudia. Halfway there, his stride shortened. Merritt noticed immediately. "Aurel?" The dog kept moving. 3 more steps. Then the rear legs faltered. His hindquarters dropped. Merritt reached him before his chest hit the snow. Claudia was beside them almost at once. "Aurel!" The shepherd tried to rise. The rear legs trembled. "Don't!" Merritt placed one hand against his chest. Aurel pushed against it anyway, still trying forward. That frightened Merritt more than the collapse. The dog was exhausted and still attempting to continue. Dean came running from the cabin. Gareth was behind him without a coat. "What happened?" "He's spent," Merritt said. "Heart?" "No, not that I can tell." Claudia knelt beside Aurel, one hand on his ribcage, breathing fast. Too fast, but regular. Merritt slipped off his gloves. "Aurel!" The shepherd looked at him. For the first time since Highway 38, Merritt saw something in those amber eyes that did not resemble purpose. Fatigue. Plain physical fatigue. The kind no loyalty could negotiate with. Merritt slid one arm beneath the chest and the other beneath the hindquarters. Aurel tried once more to stand. "No." Merritt lifted him. The shepherd weighed very little against his chest. Too little. Again Merritt felt that same anger he had felt the first evening. Only now he understood it better. Not anger at whoever had failed to feed the dog. Nobody had. Anger at the idea that devotion could continue after the body carrying it had run out of strength. Aurel rested his head against Merritt's shoulder. By the time they reached the pickup, he was no longer resisting. Merritt placed him on the rear bench and covered him with the wool emergency blanket from behind the seat. Claudia climbed in beside him. Dean stood outside the open door. "We going straight to Elise?" "Yes." Gareth had reached the truck. He looked shaken. "Call me." Dean nodded. "I will." "No." Gareth pointed toward all of them. "Actually, call me." Dean understood. "I will." Merritt shut the rear door. The drive back began quietly. Aurel slept. Claudia kept one hand on his shoulder. Merritt watched the road. The problem had changed. Until that morning, every solution seemed to involve understanding what Aurel wanted. Now, Merritt knew. Aurel wanted the route finished. The people checked. The old obligation kept alive, but knowing that did not make the decision easier. If they allowed Aurel to continue every time fresh snow woke that old routine, the dog might walk himself into collapse again, maybe worse. Yet the other option felt wrong in a different way. Lock the gates, remove the collar, keep him warm, keep him safe, reduce his world until there was nothing left in it that could hurt him. Merritt knew the logic of that choice. He also knew what it looked like when someone else decided that because you could no longer do what you once did, the safest thing was to expect nothing from you. He looked into the mirror. Aurel slept beneath the blanket, muzzle graying, ribs rising slowly. Merritt gripped the steering wheel. For the first time, the real question was not where Aurel was going. It was whether protecting him meant stopping him. And Merritt was no longer certain those were the same thing. Elise did not soften the diagnosis. A few weeks. Merritt stood beside the examination table while Aurel lay on a thick rubber mat at the Bitterroot Valley Veterinary Clinic. A few weeks of what? Rest. He hates rest. That isn't a medical category. Elise removed the stethoscope from Aurel's chest and straightened. The shepherd had recovered from the worst of the exhaustion by the time they reached Hamilton, but recovery did not mean permission. His heart remained steady. No acute joint injury. No neurological deficit. The problem was accumulation. Too many miles, too little weight, too much insistence from a body old enough to require limits. No long routes, Elise said. No pushing through fatigue, short controlled walks. Increase calories gradually. We reassess after he gains some weight and I'm happy with the hind legs. Claudia stood at the other side of the room with one hand resting on Aurel's shoulder.
And if he decides to leave again? Then don't let him. Simple, reasonable. Merritt disliked the answer immediately. That irritated him because it was also the answer he would have given 3 days earlier. Claudia glanced at him. I can add another interior gate. Merritt nodded. Probably should. A latch higher up? Probably. Maybe a second door between the mudroom and kitchen. Would work. Elise looked between them. You both sound thrilled. Neither replied. Aurel lifted his head. He watched Merritt. There was nothing accusatory in the dog's expression. That somehow made the conversation worse. Merritt crouched. You're not walking 30 miles again. Aurel blinked once. Non-negotiable. Elise crossed her arms. Good. Now explain it in German Shepherd. Merritt gave her a flat look. She smiled. On the drive back to Claudia's house, Aurel slept. Merritt followed in his own pickup and watched the Subaru ahead through a light curtain of snow. The solution should have been complete. Secure the house, control the exercise, give Aurel time to recover. Problem solved. Except that Merritt no longer believed the dog was the problem. That thought stayed with him all evening. At home, he heated soup he barely tasted and left the television off. His house was quiet in the efficient way he had built it to be. One mug in the drying rack, one coat by the door, mail stacked neatly, tools exactly where he had left them. Merritt had always treated solitude as evidence of competence. No mess because nobody else made one, no forgotten plans, no obligations requiring negotiation. He opened his phone and found Dean's number, then did not call. Instead, he opened his contacts. There were names he still recognized immediately: men from the Navy, a rescue technician from Idaho, a former county inspector who had moved to Wyoming. People he had once trusted with things more serious than conversation. Some had not heard from him in years. Merritt stared at one name for almost a minute, then locked the phone. He was not ready for that call, but he was ready for another. Dean answered on the 4th ring. You break Gareth's furnace? No. Then why are you calling after dinner? Merritt leaned against the kitchen counter. Elise says Aurel needs a few weeks off. Figured. Claudia's going to keep him in. She should. Merritt looked toward the dark window. That doesn't fix it. Dean went quiet. Fix what? The route. Merritt, you know what I mean. Silence again, then Dean sighed. Yes. Merritt turned the silver carabiner at his belt, even though he was no longer wearing field gear. He had clipped it to his jeans when he came home without thinking. Aurel kept going because nobody else did. That's one interpretation. It's the correct one. You always this pleasant when you've decided something? Usually worse. Dean laughed quietly. Merritt continued. What happened to the welfare rounds after Jonas? You saw the binder. I saw paperwork. I'm asking about people. Dean did not answer immediately. People got busy. That phrase covers a lot. It does. Gareth stopped showing up. I know. Did anybody go after him? Dean's voice hardened. You've known us for less than a week. Merritt let that stand. Dean was right. He had arrived late and found a broken habit, not the years of reasons behind it. I'm not asking who's guilty. Sounds like it. I'm asking who's willing. That changed the silence. Merritt looked at the dark reflection of himself in the kitchen window. We keep Aurel safe. Yes. And we finish the work ourselves. Dean did not laugh. Meaning you still have the list. There was a pause. Then Dean said, I'll call Gareth. Merritt looked down. Good. You volunteering too? I already did. That was the first decision. The next one spread faster than Merritt expected. Dean called Gareth. Gareth called Warren Pike, a former radio technician living outside Stevensville, and Nora Bellamy,
once a volunteer EMT who now managed a small feed store near Victor. Neither had worked with the cooperative in years. Both remembered the welfare rounds. Neither needed convincing about what had happened to them. The surprising part was not that people agreed. It was how many had assumed someone else was still doing it. By the end of the week, Claudia had made a new list. Not a restored version of the old one, a new one. That mattered to Merritt. They were not rebuilding the team. They were not naming a committee. They were not looking for grants, uniforms, sponsors, or press. They listed people, that was all. A retired mechanic recovering from hip surgery, a widow outside Florence who hated driving on ice, an old volunteer radio operator whose generator had become unreliable, a former trail medic caring for an ill spouse. People who were not emergencies. People who could easily disappear from attention because nothing dramatic had happened to them. Claudia sat at her kitchen table with 3 maps spread out. Aurel slept nearby. Merritt stood over one route. "You've got 4 stops on Friday." 5. "That one is 12 miles off the main road." "I can count." "Then you know 4 is smarter." Claudia looked up. "Was that concern?" "Logistics." "Of course." Aurel opened one eye. Claudia pointed at him. "He knows." Merritt ignored both of them. They divided the route. Dean would take the north section with Gareth. Claudia and Nora would handle the Central Valley. Merritt would take the eastern roads with Warren. Nothing heroic. That was the point. The first new winter round began on a pale Saturday morning. The sky had cleared during the night, and sunlight spilled across the Bitterroot Range with enough brightness to make the snowfields glitter. Merritt arrived at Claudia's house expecting an argument. He got one. Aurel was standing beside the Subaru. "No." The dog looked at him. "No." Claudia came around the hood carrying a thermos. "He's not walking." Elise said rest. She said controlled movement. A 6-hour route is not controlled movement. He'll be in the vehicle. Merritt looked at Aurel. The shepherd looked back. Claudia opened the rear door. A padded blanket covered the seat. Water bowl, food, everything arranged like a concession made by people who understood they were negotiating with an animal who did not know negotiation existed. "He stays in the car unless we stop somewhere safe," Claudia said. 5 minutes out at a time, no route work. Merritt hesitated. This was the question he had been avoiding. Protecting Aurel did not have to mean excluding him. There was a difference between letting him carry the job and letting him witness it continue. Merritt opened the rear door wider. "All right." Aurel climbed in, slowly, no struggle, no attempt to take the lead. Merritt watched him settle against the blanket. For the first time, that felt like progress instead of defeat. The route did not begin with Aurel choosing a direction. Claudia did. That was the change. They drove first to a small house north of Victor, where an old radio operator named Warren Pike, 66, had already stacked 3 bundles of firewood beside the porch for another stop later in the day. Warren was narrow-faced, gray-haired, and permanently amused by his own complaints. "You're late." "We're 6 minutes early," Claudia said. "Then I've been waiting incorrectly." He climbed into Dean's truck. At the next stop, they replaced a generator battery for a former volunteer who had recently injured his shoulder. At another, Claudia delivered groceries and refused reimbursement. Dean spent 20 minutes on a porch drinking coffee with a man who claimed he needed nothing. Nobody called it welfare. Nobody used the word mission. They simply stayed. At noon, the vehicles regrouped at a turnout overlooking the valley. Aurel was allowed out. He stepped carefully into the snow. Merritt expected him to orient toward the old route. Instead, the shepherd walked to the line of parked vehicles. He sniffed Dean's boot, then Gareth's, then Claudia's, then Merritt's. After that, Aurel lay down in the sunlight. Gareth watched him. "He checking attendance?" Dean smiled. "Probably judging us." Merritt looked at the dog. Aurel had spent weeks dragging his thinning body through snow because the sequence had broken. Now the sequence was moving without him,
and for once he did not seem compelled to correct it. That was the moment Merritt understood what they had actually changed. They had not found a way to keep Aurel busy. They had taken responsibility back from him. The distinction mattered. Merritt sat on the tailgate of his pickup. Gareth handed him coffee from a battered thermos. "Still think this is stupid?" Merritt looked at him. "Did I say that? You have a face for it." Merritt drank. The coffee was marginally better than Gareth's cabin brew. "Needs work. So do you." Merritt almost smiled. Below them, the highway curved through a white valley full of houses that looked small from this distance. He had spent much of his adult life thinking usefulness had to be measurable. Someone rescued, something repaired, a threat removed, a job completed. But the old welfare sheets had been full of entries like "stayed to talk." No measurable outcome, no dramatic result, still necessary. He thought again of the contacts on his phone. This time, the thought did not feel accusatory. It felt possible. By late afternoon, they completed the route. No crises, no rescues, no one stranded. One generator started more reliably, one porch had fresh firewood. 2 people had been reminded that somebody remembered where they lived. That was the entire accomplishment. Merritt found himself strangely satisfied by it. Back at Claudia's house, Aurel climbed out of the Subaru. He walked across the yard, stopped near the gate. Everyone noticed. Claudia went still. Merritt waited. Aurel looked through the fence toward the road. Fresh snow lay beyond it. For weeks that view had been enough to pull him forward. The shepherd stood there for several seconds, then turned away. He walked back toward the porch. Claudia exhaled. Merritt did not call it victory. It was one evening, one choice. Dogs did not resolve grief in clean narrative arcs, neither did people. But Aurel climbed onto the porch and lay down beside the door. Not facing outward, facing the house. Merritt crouched beside him. "You can let us screw it up for a while." Aurel rested his muzzle on his paws. Dean, standing behind Merritt, said, "That's your motivational speech?" "Best one you're getting." Gareth laughed. Claudia shook her head. The group began discussing the following week. Who needed a furnace part? Who might need a ride into Hamilton? Which road would become dangerous if the next storm arrived? Merritt listened, then added 2 names. They were no longer following a dog. They were learning the route. And somewhere in that change, Merritt began to understand that leaving one kind of service did not mean standing outside every form of service that followed. A person did not have to save the world. Sometimes it was enough to make sure one porch had firewood, one generator started, one phone call was made, one person was not forgotten. March came to Bitterroot Valley with a different kind of winter light. The snow still lay deep along the fields and under the pines, but the sun had begun climbing higher, staying long enough in the afternoon to soften the edges of drifts and send thin lines of water beneath roadside ice. A storm had passed during the night. By morning, the valley was white again. Merritt Cole started the pickup before 7. Aurel was already waiting beside the rear door. Not pacing, not pushing toward the road, waiting. Merritt opened the door, and the shepherd climbed onto the padded bench with more strength than he had shown 2 weeks earlier. Elise had approved the longer ride on the condition that Aurel remain mostly in the vehicle and continue gaining weight. His ribs no longer showed as sharply beneath the golden winter coat. The change was small. Merritt trusted small changes more than dramatic ones. Claudia arrived a few minutes later in her Subaru. Dean followed in his truck, with Gareth in the passenger seat and 2 bundles of split wood strapped behind the cab. Nobody wore matching jackets. Nobody had printed signs on the vehicles. There were no radios assigned by rank and no one calling the morning a deployment. Claudia simply held up a sheet of paper through her open window.
5 stops. Dean lifted his coffee. 6 if Gareth counts every bathroom break as a welfare check. Gareth rolled down his window. I'm 70% coffee. Maintenance is required. Merritt shook his head and climbed into his truck. Aurel had already settled against the door. They left in a loose line. The first miles followed part of the old route. Merritt noticed the approaching picnic rest area before Aurel did. Or perhaps Aurel noticed and simply chose not to react. That distinction mattered. The weathered table appeared beneath a clean cap of snow. Weeks earlier, Aurel had walked there alone and sat for 10 silent minutes, as if waiting for a morning that belonged to another life. Now he lifted his head. His amber eyes followed the table through the glass. Merritt slowed slightly. Aurel did not stand, did not press toward the door, did not whine. The picnic area disappeared behind them. Merritt looked into the mirror. Aurel remained lying down. His ears were relaxed. Good, Merritt said quietly. The shepherd glanced at him and returned his attention to the window. At the wooden bridge, the result was the same. Aurel watched, nothing more. The convoy continued without him asking it to stop. Something loosened in Merritt's chest. He had spent the past weeks trying not to attach human explanations to every movement the dog made. Aurel was still a dog. Memory, conditioning, age, comfort, anticipation, any of them could explain what Merritt was seeing. But Merritt did not need to claim the dog understood the new arrangement in words. It was enough that the old compulsion appeared to be fading. The route was moving. The people were moving. Aurel no longer had to make either happen by himself. Their first stop was a small ranch house outside Victor, where Warren Pike was already on the porch arguing with an extension cord. "Morning," Merritt called. "No, it isn't. You've been awake too long. That's because competent people wake early. You're holding the wrong end of the cord." Warren looked down, then at Merritt. "I was testing you." Merritt carried a replacement generator battery from the truck. There had been a time when a morning like this would have felt beneath him. Not in a conscious, arrogant way, something quieter. He had learned to associate urgency with significance. The more dangerous the task, the more necessary the person performing it. Now he stood in snow, carrying a battery toward a man who could probably have replaced it himself tomorrow. The work mattered because they had come today. That was enough. At the next house, Claudia brought groceries inside while Dean checked a chimney cap. At another stop, Gareth spent almost 40 minutes arguing about football with a former volunteer medic who had no equipment problems at all. Merritt sat in the truck for part of that visit. Aurel slept behind him. No crisis arrived. Nobody needed rescue. The morning continued anyway. Around noon, the vehicles turned onto an overlook above the valley. It had become their regular stopping place. The mountains rose pale blue in the distance. The Bitterroot River curved through cottonwoods below, broken sunlight moving across the snowfields as clouds passed overhead. Dean opened the tailgate. Coffee appeared. So did sandwiches. Gareth complained about the sandwiches. Claudia told him to make his own next week. Aurel was allowed out for a few minutes. He walked slowly around the vehicles, sniffed the snow near Merritt's boots, then chose a patch of sunlight beside the pickup and lay down. Merritt poured coffee. Dean stood beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Then Dean said, "We could call the paper." Merritt looked at him. "The paper?" "Hamilton." "For what?" Dean nodded toward Aurel. "You know exactly what." Merritt drank his coffee. "No." "That fast?" "Yes." Dean smiled. "Didn't even let me sell it." "There's nothing to sell." "There is, actually." Dean counted on his fingers. "Retired federal search dog, golden sentinel of the Rockies, goes missing repeatedly. Turns out he's recreating an old welfare route. Former teen gets back together." He looked pleased with himself. "Hell, the headline writes itself." Gareth called from behind them. "Make sure they spell my name wrong. I've always wanted mystery." Claudia ignored him. Dean continued. "People remember Aurel.
Some of them would like knowing he's still around. That's true. So, Merritt looked toward the shepherd. Aurel was asleep. Sunlight rested along the gold fur of his neck. The torn edge of his right ear moved once in the breeze. No harness, no vest. No photographer asking him to stand where the light was better. Merritt thought of Claudia's words at the clinic. Aurel did not know what a headline was. He never had. He doesn't need it, Merritt said. Dean's expression became more serious. I didn't say he needed it. No, Merritt turned the coffee cup between his hands, but that's how this kind of thing works. What kind of thing? People decide something matters more once strangers know about it. Dean did not respond. Merritt looked across the valley. Jonas did those rounds for years. Nobody wrote about that. No. Aurel sat in the truck. Nobody cared. No. They brought furnace filters and firewood and sat around drinking bad coffee with people who didn't technically need rescuing. Gareth lifted his cup. The coffee was excellent. It was terrible. Subjective. Merritt continued. And apparently that was the part worth remembering. Dean followed his gaze to Aurel. So we do nothing? I didn't say that either. The answer came to Merritt without much planning, maybe because it had been forming for days. Put something in the garage. Claudia joined them. What? A sign. Gareth looked suspicious. We becoming an organization now? No. Good. Organizations have minutes. Dean smiled. What goes on the sign? Merritt thought about the old training drill. The name that had first sent them in the wrong direction. Long return. A dog moving through checkpoints, remembering the road backward, except the real return had never been about geography. The long return, Merritt said. Claudia looked at him. That works. Dean nodded slowly. And underneath? Merritt had no answer. Gareth did. Nobody gets forgotten. The joking stopped, not because the phrase was grand, because it wasn't. It sounded almost like an instruction somebody might write on masking tape above a workbench. Claudia repeated it. Everybody good with that? Dean raised his cup. Good. Merritt looked toward Aurel. The dog remained asleep. Good. A week later, Dean mounted the sign inside the old lodge garage. He made it himself from a piece of pine. No polished plaque, no brass lettering, just dark burned letters across pale wood. The long return. Below it, smaller, nobody gets forgotten. They did not invite anyone for an unveiling. Gareth held one side while Dean screwed it into the wall. Claudia complained that the right edge was 3/16 of an inch lower. Dean told her she had become unbearable in retirement. Merritt stood near the garage door with Aurel. That was the ceremony, if it counted as one. The welfare rounds continued through the end of winter. Sometimes 3 people went, sometimes 5. Sometimes Merritt had county work and could not join until afternoon. The route changed depending on need. That was another important difference. It no longer belonged to Jonas. It did not belong to Aurel. It did not even belong to the old cooperative. The route belonged to whoever needed checking that week. Merritt began making other calls too, not many. He started with one former teammate he had not spoken to in 4 years. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Nothing was repaired, nothing was solved. They talked about weather, back pain, a truck transmission, and the strange fact that both of them had become men who now compared snowblowers. Afterward, Merritt sat with the phone in his hand for a while. He did not feel transformed. He simply called another person the following week. That was more believable to him. Months passed. Spring loosened the valley, then summer. By the time the first early winter storm returned, Aurel had gained weight and moved with greater steadiness, though age had not reversed itself. Nobody expected it to. The morning after that first fresh snow, Merritt woke before his alarm. For a moment he did not know why. Then he saw the light, snow reflected against the bedroom ceiling. He got dressed and walked downstairs. Aurel was lying beside the front door. That had become normal. Claudia traveled often now to help with the welfare network, and Aurel spent more time at Merritt's house, sometimes several nights in a row. The arrangement had happened without anyone formally deciding it. Merritt stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Aurel lifted his head. Once, fresh snow had pulled the dog to his feet before dawn. It had sent him against fences, through gates,
across miles of valley. Now he remained lying down. He looked at Merritt, nothing more. No scratching at the door, no pacing, no demand. Merritt stood there for several seconds. Then he smiled. All right. He walked to the coat rack, pulled on his slate jacket, clipped the scratched silver carabiner at his belt, then took the truck keys from the hook. Aurel rose slowly. Merritt opened the door. Cold morning light spilled across the floor. I know, Merritt said. Aurel waited beside him. It's our turn now. They walked to the truck together. Aurel climbed into the back seat. Merritt took the wheel. And when they reached the road, the dog did not choose the direction. He did not need to. The people had learned the way.
Sometimes the most important work in life is not the work anyone applauds. It is remembering who has gone quiet, making the call we keep postponing, or showing up at a door simply so someone knows they have not been forgotten. Aurel could not keep carrying that responsibility forever. In the end, the people around him had to learn the road for themselves. Maybe there is someone in your own life who does not need rescuing, only remembering. If this story brought someone to mind, perhaps today is a good day to reach out. Tell us what this story meant to you in the comments, and subscribe to Valor and Paw Stories if you would like to stay with us for more stories like this. May you have people who remember your road, and may you never be too busy to remember theirs.